Why 500,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Americans April 1945. Western Germany. The Ruhr Pocket. Here, over 500,000 German soldiers made a decision that, just months earlier, would have been unthinkable to the Wehrmacht High Command. These weren't conscripts from the final levy. These were the battle-hardened veterans, the most resilient men the Third Reich had left. They had endured the brutal Eastern Front, fought block to block in Kyiv, and survived the merciless freezing mud of the Ardennes. They were soldiers whose creed was simple. A field marshal does not surrender. In the Wehrmacht fights to the last man, but here, they simply stopped fighting. The largest mass surrender in the history of the Western Front. Over 325,000 men formally processed, with total captures estimated to be over 500,000. When a great army is cornered, military history dictates a savage, desperate choice, a suicidal breakout attempt, or a fanatical last stand to buy time. Think of the 60-day siege of Budapest, where Hungarian and German forces were literally annihilated but refused to capitulate. What happened in the Ruhr Pocket was the opposite. No desperate charge. No final, fanatical resistance to the last bullet. Just an eerie, overwhelming resignation. And in that silence lay a secret that terrified the German High Command more than any Allied invasion. Their most skilled soldiers had not been physically defeated, but psychologically paralyzed. They had stopped believing in the logic of resistance. What the Americans had unleashed wasn't just superior firepower. It was something far more devastating. A systematic approach to warfare that made German courage, skill, and human determination not merely futile, but functionally obsolete. The story of the Ruhr Pocket isn't about a traditional battle. It's about the moment when industrial-age warfare reached its terrifying, logical conclusion. It's about the system that broke the will of 500,000 men by proving that everything they believed in, their pride, their training, their tactical genius, no longer mattered. To understand the scale of this collapse, we must first appreciate the immense pride that formed the very foundation of German military doctrine for over a century. The Wehrmacht believed its strength lay not in material wealth, but in the superior quality of its individual soldiers and its command structure. Their core philosophy was Auftragstaktik, decentralized mission command. Unlike the Allied armies, which often relied on rigid, top-down orders and strict adherence to a pre-written plan, the German system was fluid. Every junior commander, every lieutenant, every squad leader was given the authority to improvise and achieve the mission objective by their own means. If a German lieutenant spotted an opening on the battlefield, he could exploit it faster than an American colonel could receive orders from division headquarters. This system was custom-built for speed, tactical flexibility, and independent thinking. German soldiers received unparalleled training. They weren't just taught to operate weapons. They were taught to think strategically at the tactical level. A German squad leader often had the training and battlefield authority equivalent to many Allied platoon or even company commanders. This focus on individual skill allowed smaller German forces to achieve disproportionate results and inflict devastating losses. This tactical superiority was painfully demonstrated against Green U.S. troops at Kasserine Pass in 1943. That defeat was a watershed moment, a stark, humiliating lesson that forced General Eisenhower to completely restructure American training doctrine from the ground up. German commanders held a deeply ingrained, almost spiritual belief: we may be outnumbered, we may be outgunned, but as long as our tactical excellence and superior willpower are maintained, we can offset American industrial might. They believed war would always be decided by individual tactical engagements, by the small, decisive firefight where the better-trained soldier making the better decision wins. Their entire military culture was designed to win those moments. This was the source of their unshakable confidence. But by April 1945, this very confidence, this intense focus on tactical genius, had become their fatal weakness. They were prepared for a duel of highly skilled swordsmen, while their enemy was bringing a relentless, impersonal, systematic machine. April 4, 1945. The American pincer movement closed near the town of Lippstadt, the final moment of truth. In just 12 days, American armored spearheads achieved what German military doctrine considered operationally impossible: the complete encirclement of an entire Army Group, Field Marshal Walter models. Army Group B over 430,000 men, including the veterans of the 116th Panzer Division, in the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 miles wide. Field Marshal Model, one of Hitler's most capable defensive specialists, was the man responsible for the last-ditch defense of the West. His planning documents, meticulously captured after the surrender, confirmed his adherence to established defensive principles. The Germans were ready for a classic siege. They utilized the Ruhr region's natural industrial advantages: countless factories, broken terrain, rivers, and canals, which were ideal for defense. Every position was fortified, every bridge wired for demolition. Ammunition and food were meticulously stockpiled for weeks of combat. Their doctrine guaranteed that determined defenders could inflict casualties at a 3-to-1 ratio or worse. The goal was simple, yet strategically vital: make American victory too expensive in time and blood. Lieutenant General Fritz Berlin, a commander who had survived North Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes, constantly emphasized the historical principle: American forces will attack until casualties become politically unacceptable, then pause to reorganize. Our goal is not to win the war, but to buy time by making them pay in blood for every single kilometer. The German commanders went into the encirclement, not with fear, but with confidence in their proven defensive doctrine. They were prepared for a fight where tactical skill and sheer determination would offset massive material disparity. Yet, within days of the pocket's formation, the veterans were doing the unthinkable. Entire divisions were surrendering en masse, often without a sustained fight. The reason? The Americans were not fighting the battle the Germans had prepared for. The Germans had prepared for a siege. The Americans had come to execute an industrial processing operation. They didn't intend to defeat the German soldier in a fair fight. They intended to systematically render him irrelevant. The Americans called their systematic approach vertical envelopment. It was a clinical term for a revolution in combined arms warfare. A doctrine engineered not just to destroy German combat capability, but to negate human courage itself. The key wasn't a secret bomb or tank. It was systematic operational integration, which military historians would later recognize as the first true demonstration of synchronized warfare, the psychological. Devastation came from the realization that nothing the German soldiers did could change the outcome. The American system activated on April the P-38 reconnaissance. Aircraft flew timed grid patterns over the entire pocket. They weren't just looking for isolated targets. They were mapping the entire sprawling German defensive network in real time, creating a living picture of every strongpoint, supply dump, and troop movement. By cataloging every pass, American intelligence officers weren't predicting German moves through tactical genius. They were predicting them through statistical patterns based on the very defensive doctrine the Germans followed. Their flexibility made them predictable. American artillery then began firing, not where German troops were at that moment, but precisely where they would be in 30 minutes. Based on the observed movement patterns, German commanders were baffled. After-action reports repeatedly used the word uncanny. American fire seemed to anticipate their every maneuver. This was not genius. It was systematic observation, creating predictive patterns that negated the core tenet of German tactical flexibility. The firepower itself was overwhelming. Colonel Edwin Luther's time-on-target method coordinated multiple artillery battalions firing from different locations, timing shells to impact simultaneously. A German position might spot one ranging shot and attempt to displace, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive in a devastating, unexpected 5-second window. The sheer, terrifying volume and coordination crushed the morale of veterans who had survived the most brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. But artillery was just the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't waste time attacking German strongpoints. They bypassed them entirely, Reconnaissance and radio communication identified gaps in the German line within hours of their formation. Tank columns exploited these gaps before German reserves could respond, instantly cutting off entire units from supply and communication. By the time German commanders identified a problem, communicated orders, and began executing a response, relying on their traditional, flexible Auftragstaktik, American forces had already advanced to the next phase. They were always responding to situations that no longer existed. As Lieutenant Karl Godam of the 116th Panzer Division wrote in his journal, "We are fighting yesterday's battle while they are already positioning for tomorrow's. Our commanders make correct decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. Our flexibility is useless when every move is anticipated." The American system wasn't trying to outthink the Germans, it had made thinking irrelevant. The tactical genius the Germans relied on for 5 years was now trapping them in a predictable, fatal pattern, leading to the systemic collapse we will explore in devastating detail in Part 2 in the final days of the encirclement. The German soldiers of Army Group B realized something chilling. The Americans weren't just winning battles. They had created a form of warfare that made traditional military virtues useless. The most highly decorated, highly trained German veterans, men who had faced the limitless manpower of the Soviet Union, now confronted an enemy that operated with an entirely different logic. The Soviets fought with massive human waves, overwhelming their opponents through sheer numbers and ferocious determination. Against the Soviets, a brave man could still make a difference. A skilled German machine gun crew could hold a position for hours, inflicting a terrible cost. Individual courage and tactical genius could buy time, create local victories, and save lives. But against the Americans, that equation was brutally reversed. The Americans didn't rush. They didn't take unnecessary risks. They advanced with the methodical, impersonal inevitability of an industrial process. The German soldiers began calling it Walzer, the steamroller war. You couldn't outfight a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you and then be crushed or step aside. Every German tactical strength was now a liability. Their flexibility allowed American reconnaissance to predict their responses. Their courage only meant they died for nothing, holding a crossroads that American armor had already bypassed miles ago. The supply situation highlighted the absurdity. German forces within the pocket had ammunition stockpiled for weeks. But the ammunition was useless if every firing position was already registered by American artillery. They had food, but they had no way to deploy it to starving frontline units because every road, every movement, drew immediate, overwhelming fire. The system was perfect because it didn't require perfection from individual American soldiers. It only required adherence to the synchronized timetable. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, wrote in his diary during this period, acknowledging the devastating internal truth. "Against the Americans, our tactical doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that served us well against the Poles, French, and even Soviets now works against us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has prepared responses to every option. We are fighting an opponent who doesn't need to outthink us. They've made thinking irrelevant." The breaking point for the German Army Group B was not a single engagement. It was the cumulative realization that resistance had become functionally meaningless. It was the psychological defeat that preceded the physical one. The American operational tempo moved faster than the German decision cycle. By the time a German commander identified a problem, communicated the order to respond, and had the troops moving, the American forces had already transitioned to the next phase of the operation. The orders were obsolete before they were even executed. The collapse was documented in real time by US intelligence teams monitoring captured German communications. Radio intercepts revealed a chilling pattern. Initial confidence quickly dissolved into confusion, followed by desperation and finally, resignation. The 9th Panzer Division provides one of the clearest examples. On April 10th, the division commander reported full combat readiness. With 47 operational tanks and over 4,000 effectives, he issued orders for aggressive counterattacks, following proven doctrine. Just 3 days later, the same commander General Harold von Elverfeldt, reported to Field Marshal Model, "Every movement draws immediate artillery fire. Every concentration draws air attack. We advance 500 meters, and American armor appears on our flanks. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender." On April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered his division. Crucially, they still had 38 operational tanks and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When interrogated, he stated, "I surrendered not because we were defeated, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." The industrial dimension of American warfare played a subtle but crushing psychological role. American units that suffered casualties received replacements within days. Equipment losses were replaced overnight. The ammunition expenditure that would have crippled a German division for weeks was considered routine by US standards. The 3rd Armored Division alone fired more artillery shells on April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the entire preceding week. German soldiers began to feel they were fighting not an army, but a limitless, cold machine that simply refueled, rearmed and returned to work, in caring of their sacrifice. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, was known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Lion of Defense. He was Hitler's firefighter, the man sent in when all seemed lost. He was the embodiment of the very tactical excellence that was now failing. Model had seen everything. He had led desperate, successful defensive battles against the Red Army, and he knew how to fight outnumbered. But as the encirclement tightened, Model received reports from his field commanders that contradicted all his experience. His veteran soldiers weren't being routed. They were simply walking away. His final operational orders revealed a man caught in an impossible internal conflict. He was an officer of the old school, whose personal code was clear. A field marshal does not surrender. But he was also a soldier who could no longer justify the senseless slaughter of his men against a foe whose tactics had broken the rules of war he knew. On April 17th, Model effectively dissolved his command. He authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance pointless, effectively releasing his men from their oath of loyalty without formally capitulating himself. It was a half measure, a desperate attempt to reconcile his personal honor with the reality of the situation. He knew the cost of his choice. Model had been personally designated by Hitler as one of the few commanders expected to fight to the last bullet. Surrender, even implicit surrender, was unthinkable. On April 18th, with the disintegration of his command complete, Field Marshal Model walked into a small wooded area near the village of Rattingen. He left no note. He did not surrender to the Americans. He raised a pistol to his head and ended his life. His aide recorded his final words, "A field marshal does not surrender, and I cannot ask my men to do what I cannot." Model's suicide was not the act of a coward. It was the ultimate tragic admission that the war, as he understood it, the war based on courage, leadership, and tactical skill, was over. His final act confirmed the deep, structural failure of the entire German military philosophy against the American system. The surrender that followed Model's death was an administrative marvel. The Americans handled the capitulation of entire divisions with the same systematic efficiency they applied to combat. The vast majority of German soldiers surrendered, not because they were defeated in a decisive tank engagement or overwhelmed by an infantry charge, but because they had been made obsolete by the logistics of American war. Prisoner processing stations operated on assembly line principles. German soldiers were disarmed, documented, given food and water, and moved to rear areas within hours. The efficiency itself was demoralizing. The Americans handled the capture of 325,000 men with minimal disruption, reinforcing the German soldiers' final, bitter realization: you couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you, and then be processed or crushed. The final numbers tell the story of the system's triumph. American casualties during the entire Ruhr operation, approximately 2,000 killed and 10,000 wounded. German casualties, approximately 10,000 killed in combat. With the remainder, over 315,000 men, captured. The casualty ratio, which military doctrine predicted would heavily favor the defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. The Ruhr operation proved that the United States military had created a system where human factors, courage, tactical skill, leadership became operationally irrelevant. The German soldier hadn't been defeated by a better man. He had been neutralized by a better process. General Eisenhower's report to the combined chiefs of staff summed up this terrifying new reality. The Ruhr operation demonstrated that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The key is systematic integration of all combat arms operating at a tempo that prevents enemy response. The 500,000 German soldiers who surrendered hadn't been defeated in battle. They had been made obsolete by a form of warfare that didn't require defeating them, only processing them. The distinction marked the end of warfare as previous generations had understood it, and heralded the terrifying age of systemic warfare. A new American doctrine that promised victory through inevitability, and not heroism. The horrifying efficiency demonstrated in the Ruhr Pocket didn't appear overnight. It was a brutal, hard-won lesson learned from humiliating defeat, engineered and perfected over 2 years by the American military machine. The blueprint for what became systematic warfare was forged in the fire of failure, specifically in the scorching sands of North Africa. In February 1943, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Green American forces met veteran German units. The result was a tactical disaster for the US. American forces were routed, suffering massive casualties and a humiliating setback. The Germans, relying on their superior Auftragstaktik, their tactical genius, easily outmaneuvered the numerically and materially superior American forces. The lesson for the Wehrmacht was simple. Material superiority means nothing against superior skill. But for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the lesson was far deeper. He'd realized that the American military, accustomed to industrial dominance, was fatally reliant on raw courage and material output. They were losing battles because they were fighting an individual's war against an army trained for initiative. Eisenhower and his staff concluded that they could not, and perhaps should not, try to beat the Germans at their own tactical game. The American advantage was never going to be in the skill of a single squad leader, but in the unbeatable scale of its industry. The solution wasn't to train better lieutenants. It was to build a system where the skill of the German lieutenant simply didn't matter. They shifted their focus from winning tactical battles to establishing overwhelming operational superiority. The Americans stopped playing checkers and started playing a massive game of three-dimensional chess, where they controlled all the pieces and the clock. This systemic transformation began with the realization that the US military's true secret weapon wasn't the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang. It was the unbroken industrial heartland of the United States. The core of the systematic warfare doctrine was the integration of a logistical pipeline that the Germans couldn't even conceptualize. While the German military was built on the premise of living off the land and capturing fuel and supplies, the American military was built on a supply network that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean and delivered an average of 26,000 tons of supplies daily to the front in early 1945. This wasn't just about trucks. It was about predictive deployment. Brigadier General Truman Forson, on General Omar Bradley's staff, developed what he called the Red Ball system, a coordinated methodology that turned logistics into a decisive weapon. This system ensured that the moment an armored division crossed the Rhine, the fuel, the ammunition, and the replacement parts were already staged and moving to their next objective. This logistical scale fueled the most psychologically devastating element: artillery dominance. The German defensive doctrine assumed that American artillery, despite being more numerous, would eventually run out of ammunition, or at least suffer crippling delays. This was a critical miscalculation. The 3rd Armored Division alone had dedicated artillery support equivalent to what an entire German Army Corps could deploy. When American forces needed it, over 300 guns could fire coordinated, sustained missions. The amount of metal hurled at the Ruhr Pocket defenders was beyond calculation, beyond endurance. But the psychological blow was not the noise. It was the inevitability. Every shell fired, every plane that flew overhead, was a stark, screaming reminder that the American war machine was endless, tireless, and utterly unconcerned by German sacrifice. The logistics didn't just support the fighting, the logistics were the fighting. They created the tempo, the pressure, in the suffocating predictability that turned determined German defenders into demoralized prisoners. The Ruhr Pocket was a perfect, devastating operational experiment. It demonstrated that modern warfare could be won, not by genius, but by process. The enduring, terrifying lesson was that human factors became optional. In the aftermath, the psychological studies conducted by U.S. Army psychiatrists with surrendered German troops confirmed the core hypothesis of synchronized warfare. Soldiers consistently described a sense of helplessness unlike anything experienced on the Eastern Front. One German sergeant told interrogators, "Against the Russians, a brave man might survive and he might save his comrades. Against the Americans, bravery just meant you died for nothing." The American system effectively removed the agency from the enemy soldier. There was no opportunity for heroism because there was no opportunity for influence. A company of highly motivated German soldiers could defend a crossroads successfully for 6 hours, inflicting casualties, only to discover that American armor had already bypassed their position entirely and cut off their line of retreat miles behind them. Their tactical victory was operationally meaningless. The Ruhr operation created a template for future American military action. The principles of synchronized movement, predictive fire, and overwhelming logistical support became the bedrock of U.S. military doctrine for the rest of the 20th century. It marked the end of the old war, the era of decisive engagements led by brilliant generals and brave soldiers. It began the era of modern warfare, a cold, calculated industrial contest where the best system, not the bravest man, wins. Field Marshal Model's final words: "A field marshal does not surrender," were a tragic echo of a world that no longer existed. His men made the logical choice, acknowledging a truth their commanders could not. The battle was not lost. It was simply superseded. The story of the Ruhr Pocket serves as a final, chilling warning about the nature of warfare in the industrial age and beyond. It teaches us that courage and skill are only valuable if the enemy allows them to be. The Americans didn't just win the war in Europe, they revolutionized the very definition of victory. They showed that the ultimate goal of war is not the destruction of the enemy army, but the destruction of the enemy's will to fight, achieved by making their continued existence utterly pointless. The 500,000 German soldiers who walked out of the forests and factories of the Ruhr did so because they recognized this cold, hard truth. They had been defeated not by the better soldier, but by the unbeatable system. They had been made obsolete. The weapon wasn't a piece of technology. It was the seamless integration of every element of national power into a machine that was designed to grind down the enemy's will to dust. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying military legacy of World War II.